Because if you've got
Right.
the ability to change processes, you can now pivot on a dime when something happens. So, for example, let's say a global pandemic comes along that completely disrupts supply chains and it changes people's business models.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I get the absolute privilege of sitting down with BPM specialists and practitioners, those that are putting BPM into practice day in and day out with organizations, whether they work internally or whether they're coming in from a consulting perspective where they're working with many different organizations across many different industries. It's always very valuable and insightful. I always learn a lot. So I encourage you, if you're just starting to listen to this right now, grab out your notepads and pens. We're going to learn a lot in this episode. And I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Sandy Kemsley, who is a BPM Industry Analyst and Architect based out of Toronto, Canada at the moment. Obviously, pre-2020 was, well, not maybe not obviously, but pre-2020 was doing a lot of work globally, traveling around the world, and we're certainly living in a different time at the moment. But Sandy, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and having this chat today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here.
That's great. And what we might start with, and what our audience appreciates hearing or enjoys hearing, is how did you get first started in BPM? When was BPM first introduced to you? And then take us on a journey leading up to what you're doing today.
Sure. So I started in scientific imaging, which is satellite imaging and medical imaging and that type of thing. It's my degree is in engineering, and I started out writing code for doing all of this complex analysis of scientific data. This was quite a while ago, and the programming language was Fortran, just to give you an idea how long ago that was.
Right.
And that was kind of interesting for a while, and then I started looking at document imaging. And then as you get into document imaging, there's always imaging and workflow that go together. Like this was, in the sort of the 80s and 90s, as that was going along together. And then as I started to look at imaging and workflow, I realized I was much more interested in the process side of it than I was in the imaging side of it. So the imaging side is a necessary sort of vehicle to have there when you're talking about documents. But really, I wanted to look at how we can make those processes better. So over the years, I started two different companies, one where we created an early desktop imaging and workflow product, and then a services company where we were customizing BPM systems, mostly for large financial services and insurance clients. So we would help them drive out their requirements. We would customize what was required in the BPM systems at that time, or these were still the imaging and workflow systems in those days, and then install them, train them, and then let them go on their way to improve their processes. So I decided after a while I wanted to take a break from running companies, and I somehow ended up as the BPM evangelist for FileNet before they were acquired by IBM. Right. And so I ended up traveling all over the world. It was great. I was with them about 16 or 18 months, and I think I was in 14 different countries during that time. And a lot of my work was talking to customers or prospective customers at a conference or something about how the new BPM product, the FileNet BPM product, could be used to really transform business operations. So I continued in that state of helping to build that bridge between technology and business and around processes and business operations. After a couple of years of that, I decided that wasn't really much of a break. And so I ended up moving. I'd been living in California. I moved back to Toronto, and I started my current consulting company. And then my current company is just me. And I split my time now between being an independent industry analyst and then doing more classic consulting work. So on the analyst side, I work with vendors. I do conference presentations, webinars, white papers, other sorts of educational thought leadership content. And sometimes this is more common with smaller vendors, is I might help them with product strategy or go-to-market strategy, or some of the internal strategy things that they have around their product or how it fits into the market. Right. And then on the consulting side of my business, I work mostly with financial services and insurance customers, and I will help them with technical strategy, technical architecture, whatever they need in helping their implementing their business automation projects. So it's kind of getting in there and helping them put together all the pieces that they need. So again, it's kind of always been gluing together those things and helping people to find solutions that make their business run better.
Yes, great. That's good. And you would obviously having that experience and working with many different organizations, I guess, particularly in financial services and insurance, you would have seen, I guess, different levels of process maturity, different organizations at different levels of, I guess, process understanding, the way they manage their processes. What would you say is one of the biggest hurdles or one of the biggest challenges an organization will face when, I guess, trying to adopt and implement BPM? And obviously that's quite broad. There's various stages. You've got automation and everything. But what are some of the biggest challenges?
Well, it used to be the technology, because the technology used to be pretty hard to work with, but the technology has got easier and easier. And the thing is that BPM is ultimately about changing the way that an organization works. And it's this adaptation to change that's often the biggest challenge, and both at the organizational level and at the individual level. Now, just to paraphrase Leo Tolstoy, because you have to throw in like an old Russian every time you talk about things, everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. So they want the impact of the transformation. It's say, everybody's talking about business transformation, but when it comes down to you saying, well, that requires that you're going to have to change the way you do this, a lot of companies are very reluctant to do that. And then the individuals look at their job changing, and they can be quite resistant to that. So you can have a lot of different kinds of transformation on a BPM journey. You can be changing an organization's whole business model, or you could be changing the business that they're in. So that means that not only does the organization and the upper level management have to get their head around, well, this is going to enable us to go into completely different markets and provide different products and services, but the people inside the organization have to change how they do their day-to-day job and what their day-to-day job is, and also how they're measured on that work. So it's really that change that I think is the current biggest challenge. It's like, 20 years ago, I would have said it's the technology, because we were just struggling with getting all the technology pieces together. But now it's really about change management.
Yes, that's good. And would you say that, I guess on that point, would you say that it's harder for people to change to radical innovation, where you mentioned there, where some organizations completely change their business model? Maybe a startup has come into the space and is totally disrupting the way that industry does things. Or would you say it's harder for the change or the improvement to be adopted when it's iterative and small? At first thought, when I was thinking about it, as you were speaking, I was thinking that it makes sense that the radical innovation would be harder for people to change with. But I guess with radical innovation, it's very clear. We were doing this, we're doing this now. But with the micro improvements or the iterative improvements, I guess some of the process participants or performers could fall into the old way of doing things, because it's only slightly different or slightly changed.
Right. Yeah, it's not enough of a change. No, I'd have to agree with you, Daniel. It's like, it's sometimes better to say, okay, we're going to make this big change, and then that's you're just going to have to adapt to it. And it's harder for them to slide back into the old way of doing things. But that being said, I'm a big fan of the whole concept of minimum viable product. It's like when you're doing an implementation of a new business automation system, you want to get things into production as quickly as possible, and then learn from the experiences that people have to decide what has to be done next. So that first step is probably a big one, because you're really disrupting how they're doing things. And then you might have a number of smaller incremental changes as you go along, and then possibly some other big jumps when you reach certain points in the development. But yeah, I think it's going to be a balance of the two. And sometimes that big jump helps to sort of jar people out of their complacency with, well, no, this is the way that we have to do it.
Yes, right. And for someone that's listening right now that maybe they're about to start on a transformation or start to adopt a BPM solution or something like that, how do you bring process participants and performers, the ones who ultimately you're changing their processes, how do you bring them along for the journey? How do you get buy-in and sponsorship from them so that you're not faced with a ton of resistance?
Well, it's really like I think it's really like any kind of project, but especially about any IT project that I've ever been involved in, is you have to show people what's in it for them. And this means different things at different levels. So you have to have the story for the senior executives about why you want to implement this and why it's a good idea. And that will have to do with being able to meet corporate goals or being able to change the business model or whatever it is that's their kind of hot button. And then you have to have a different story for the departmental managers, which might be around, certainly some things like efficiency and so on, but also being able to change the way they do things in a department more easily. So for them, it might be more about the being able to make changes more easily and also being able to monitor what's going on in their department more easily. And then at the individual participant level, it's different again. They don't really care about the high level. Well, maybe they do, but it's not a day-to-day thing for them to be thinking about those high level corporate goals, or even about the departmental manager wanting to have some dashboard that shows how things are happening. You're not going to sell them on that. You're going to sell them on why it makes it easier for them to do their job. So then it'll be like, well, we have these helper applications, possibly that do some of the routine work instead of you having to do all the routine work. So where maybe you spent part of your time doing some value added knowledge work and then part of the time doing some sort of copying and pasting back and forth to a document. It's like, well, let us do all that copying and pasting. Let's automate that part and let you focus on the interesting part of your job. So it's really about that. What's in it for me at every level in the organization, and having a different, and obviously those stories need to tie together, but you want to have something that's really targeted at different people and their different needs.
Yeah, okay. So speaking their language and making sure that you understand, well, what keeps them up at night? What are their KPIs or their targets? What are the things that when they're on the train to work or driving into work, that they're already thinking over because it is important for them in their role?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and also like I find at the individual participant level, like when I go out and first meet with a customer, like an insurance company or something like that, I'll walk around their operations and I'll talk to the people in their operations, because I can't really understand how to help them with strategy and architecture if I don't understand what their operations look like. And one of the things you'll see from the fairly high powered individuals who are working, the ones that have some level of experience, is they're like, oh yeah, I like this part of my job because I'm analyzing this, or I'm doing this for customers or whatever. And then we have like this boring thing where we have to, log all this data or assemble all of these numbers. And it's like, whoa, we could automate that. And then your job would have less of the boring parts and more of the interesting parts. And for them, that's a big win. Now, that eventually rolls up to, well, okay, if you're automating some of the things, then you're getting better quality and you're getting better performance and higher efficiency and so on. So that's going to make a difference up the food chain as well. But you want to think about what it means for that person. And for that person, it means they don't have to do those boring bits of their job anymore.
Yes. Yeah, that's great. And then when pitching to the top management or senior leadership, how do you go about, what do they want to hear? How do you speak their language? I'd imagine that, case studies or examples of how BPM has been adopted elsewhere and has provided value. I guess that's what they're looking for, is those tangible results. What is it? If I chuck $1 in, how much am I going to get back out? Would you say that's the language that you need to speak?
Well, it's not always about efficiency gains, though. Like people go to the efficiency gains, but in many cases, it's about business agility. The reason that you're doing this is to get yourself on technology platforms that are going to allow you to make changes in your business really quickly. Because if you've got the ability to change processes, you can now pivot on a dime when something happens. So, for example, let's say a global pandemic comes along that completely disrupts supply chains and it changes people's business models. And the companies that did really well in like the last year and a half were the ones who were able to change their processes and change the way their business worked quickly to adapt to that. Like usually we think about technology as the big disruptor for businesses, but if there's anything the last year and a half has shown us is there's other things that can be equally disruptive. And if you can leverage the technology, if you have the technology and the business practices in place to say, well, we can change our process, or we can change our business model, or we can start selling directly to consumers instead of selling to businesses, for example, or like there's all kinds of things when you think about how businesses have changed over the last year and a half, that what did they have to have, or how did they have to think about their business in order to be able to do that? So for the top level executives then, although a couple of years ago, it was all about, oh, you put these systems in because it's all about productivity. Let's measure efficiency, let's measure productivity, and make sure that the bean counters are happy with this, right? But I think that the more innovative ones are looking at how does this let us change what we're doing and change the way we're doing it. And in some cases, you mentioned earlier about sometimes it's when there's some startup who comes in and disrupts things. And we saw this in insurance. So insurance is and I work with a lot of insurance customers, and insurance is one of the, I hate to say it, like stuck in the dark ages companies, or types of company when it comes to their technology, but also their processes and how they do things. They change very slowly. They're extremely conservative, for good reason. And these are usually quite old companies as well. So they have like ways of doing things. And then we started to see these online insurance companies that are doing things in very different ways. And there was one that came out a few years ago. I think it was called Lemonade. And it was just looking at the renter's insurance market. So if you were renting in an apartment, and it was I think mostly in the New York area. So you were renting an apartment and you needed to have insurance, for like your contents and whatever. So you could go in and get insurance with them. And they said that they could issue you a policy using their app in something like 2 minutes. And it's like, okay, that's not really that hard to do that. And then they looked at how they manage claims. And they said, well, we can settle a claim in 3 minutes. And I'm looking at that and it's like, wow, most of my insurance clients settle a claim in like 3 weeks, maybe if it's a simple one, but not 3 minutes. And it's because they were starting to use artificial intelligence. They were starting to use just different methods of doing things, that they were able to settle a claim completely automatically in many cases. And by the time somebody had finished putting their claim data into the app, it's the money for the results from the claim, the proceeds from the claim would be deposited in their bank account already. Now, This is a big disruptor, and you're not going to do that in all parts of the market. But if you look at that segment of the market where it's relatively low risk, it's relatively low dollar value items, and then there's a lot of policies, you want to be able to have those small frequent transactions like that as automated as possible. Otherwise, you're never going to make money off it, and you're not going to be able to expand the market either. So that showed a lot of these big insurance companies that they needed to go into the online insurance business. Now, they've all been doing it since then, and some of them have had some success, and some of them have not had a lot of success. And the ones that have had success are the ones that disengage themselves from their old back offices. So their old ways of doing things. So it's not like somebody has to take what's on the online, on the app, and then type it into their mainframe claim system and then have it grind through the manual process. They need to completely change that. So it's now new technology, new processes, new ways of doing things, more automation. And that's really been the thing that's allowed them to make a shift. The ones that are stuck in the old way of doing things, they might have a pretty website that gathers the information, but behind the scenes, there's still the same old company doing things the same old way, and they're not making any headway into these new markets because of that.
Yeah, right. And I guess that's why big organizations, when they acquire a startup or something like that, they'll actually retain or keep as much of that team as possible, because they do have an agile culture, a culture or a team there that are thinking outside of the box and are thinking creatively. Probably the worst thing you could do is bring that product, unless the intention is to close it down and cease production of whatever it is. the worst thing you can do is bring that product in and give it to the existing team to try and run it and manage it, and then lose everything that made it special to begin with. And I've also heard of organizations now that are actually have kind of like incubators internally, where they are creating environments for essentially a startup to I guess, get started inside the company, to be able to think outside the box, think how can we disrupt what we're already doing, so that instead of having to acquire potential competitors, you're actually, I guess, creating an environment where you're fostering these ideas, this innovation internally. When I spoke with
organic innovation.
Yeah,
Yes. Yeah.
exactly. I spoke with Michael Roseman a while back now, but that was a big thing that he was talking about was innovation. Too many organizations are focused on making iterative micro improvements, and not enough on innovation. Like, how are we creating the future? Because if you don't create the future, your competitor is going to create the future for you.
Exactly. And I think there's some big organizations that do a really good job of that, of incubating that innovative spirit inside their own organization. And then there's other ones where they'll acquire some really innovative company and you just wait for them to crush the souls of those poor people who are in the acquired company, because they're, it's like the board, right? They're getting assimilated into some big company, and eventually they'll get split up and moved around. So it's really, I think, very different models for how larger companies handle innovation internally. In a lot of cases, large companies find it hard to do innovation on a broad scale, and it's really necessary to have those little pockets of innovation that can just behave differently without being worried about, big company politics or infrastructure or whatever.
That's great. And I want to just track back to a point we were making earlier. You were talking about how the last year has been very disruptive for a lot of organizations, and forcing them to change the way they do business or deliver value. What would you, I guess, for someone that's listening right now, that they're from an organization that has a lower maturity level when it comes to process management, and it could be for a number of reasons. I know that over going back 10, 15 years ago, there were, many organizations that I've come across, at least, that embarked on a process documentation exercise that took 18 months, 2 years to complete. There was no real purpose or why behind doing it. They were told to do it. And once they documented everything, it kind of just sat there collecting dust, all of that process documentation. So when they hear about BPM now, I guess the attitude is, we've tried that. It didn't really do anything for us. It didn't really deliver any value for us. I guess for those people that are listening, that may be working in environments that has that sort of perspective on BPM, how has BPM been a game changer for those organizations in the last 18 months that do have their processes well documented? What is that like practically? What did that look like for them? What does that mean for them to have a good understanding of their process? How does it allow them to be agile and to, as you mentioned, pivot on a dime?
Well, there's two kind of main things that I've seen that have really hit companies in the last year and a half. One has been supply chains, and the other has been markets, like who they sell to. So one is how they're getting things in that become part of their product or services, and then how they're pushing that out to customers. So the supply chain side, this is being able to source things from different suppliers and have things take different routes as they get to you. So, if you're manufacturing products, for example, it's like maybe you were getting a certain product from a place in China and you had to source it from from somewhere else, because you couldn't get access to the Chinese market for a period of time. Or maybe you were the way that things were shipping, they were coming by ship, and you needed to look at were there other ways that we could move things around? Could we move them by air instead of by ship, because there was now more capability for air freight than there was before, because there was less passenger traffic. Like, being able to have that flexibility in supply chains was the difference, really, for companies being able to make their products or not make their products. So even if they didn't change what their product was, just being able to get the supplies to change that. And how many times have we seen in the last year and a half is that, oh, well, we can't get this anymore, so we can't, or we have a hard time getting this particular piece of our product, so we can't manufacture a product. And that's why this or that is 3 months backlogged or 6 months backlogged. Something you used to be able to just order off Amazon and have delivered the next day is now might be several months away. So for example, I'm looking at my Logitech webcam right now. And when this all started, I had like a crappy old webcam and I thought, oh, I'll just go online and buy another one. And it took 6 months to get just a standard high def webcam. And it's like, it was astounding. And it was because, first of all, everybody wanted them. So there was like a lot of demand in the marketplace. And then their supply chains were quite disrupted with how they were creating them and shipping them into their markets. So that whole supply chain, even without changing who they're selling to or what they're selling, is completely disrupted. If you have a good understanding of your processes, then you know that if this part of your supply chain gets disrupted, then that's going to cause a choke point here, or it's going to have this impact on your ability to deliver products. So having just a good understanding of that process, even if that process isn't fully automated, it's just having that process documented so that you understand it is a big thing. And if it is automated, then all the better, because then you're able to say, well, okay, let's look at what are the demand on this or that part of the process and just change where our orders are going, or where, what plant they're being shipped to, or where things are being manufactured. And, we have a problem in this plant because there's an outbreak. So let's move things over to this plant to do the manufacturing. So that's the one side of it, is the whole supply chain, even if you are selling exactly the same thing. The other is what markets people are selling to. So you look at, and this is a little bit about changing the products themselves. So one of the things that we've seen big time in the marketplace that's affected me as a consumer is about food. So, there was quite a while where things were locked down, and it was like you would go to the grocery store, maybe buy a few things, and then you couldn't get certain things and so on. And at the same time, all of these restaurant suppliers, the ones that normally supplied food to restaurants, their business was cut almost to zero, because we had there was no in-restaurant dining for quite a while. And in fact, here in Toronto, we've only just opened up to outside dining a few weeks ago. So we had one of the longest lockdowns anywhere, as it was in our area. So what happened is the restaurant suppliers pivoted to start selling to the home cook. So I started ordering directly from, a butcher who would normally supply to restaurants, and somebody who could like to bring fresh produce and this type of thing. And they'd bring it in boxes. And, sometimes it meant getting a little bit more than you expected, but it wasn't a lot. They had changed how they were doing their packaging. They were changing so that you could do online ordering, which they didn't have before. You used to, the restaurants would telephone in their order. Well, you're not going to move from having 100 customers to having 10,000 customers and still have that piece of the process be the same, right? Yeah. So they had to move to online ordering, and they had to move to a very streamlined delivery process. So everything changed. By changing who their market was, they had to change their product, if you will, which was a lot about packaging and how they sold it and who they were delivering to, because they were now delivering to homes rather than restaurants. So that was a really good example of, if you look at which ones were able to adapt, which ones were able to pivot to online ordering and be able to repackage what they used to be selling in enormous boxes to restaurants, now in much smaller portions to home cooks, and then being able to deliver that in a way that worked for delivering to apartment buildings and private homes and this sort of thing, which isn't exactly the same as delivering to a restaurant. So yes, I just found that there was those two sides of it, the supply chain side and then the changing your market and your product side, or really gave you an idea of who had a handle on their processes and who didn't.
Yes, definitely. And I think for some organization, it's given them the push they needed to really reinvent how they do business, how do they deliver value. And I think for some people, it's actually been in a funny way, a blessing in disguise, to be able to make them rethink what they're doing and challenge why they were doing the things the way they were before.
Yes, absolutely. It's been a big challenge to, well, okay, you do not need to have telephone orders anymore, and you don't need to have people come into the store to buy things. It's just, there were a lot of, these small little, on the food topic, I like to cook and eat. So, it's I think about food a lot. When you lock down for a year and a half, you think about food a lot. And, these little higher end gourmet shops where I used to go in and browse and buy a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It's a couple of the very popular ones very quickly went to online ordering. And it's like, well, okay, I can do an online order and then I can go and pick it up at the door. Like they have a bag for me. I've already paid for it. It's got my name on it, and they, open up the door and hand it out, and that's it. I don't go in the shop anymore. And having done that, like there's certain things that you just can't imagine going back to the way they were before. So another example is that we moved house in the middle of all this, which of course was a big hassle, but as part of that was selling our old home and buying our new one. And it used to be when you did that, you would go into the lawyer's office and you would sign a lot of papers, and there'd be meetings and you'd exchange keys and all this kind of thing. This is all done online now. And I look at this, it's like you still have to sign the documents, but you're doing electronic signature, and you're on a Zoom call with your lawyer as you do this. And when I look at this compared with now it's been a long time since I bought a house before, but when I look at it compared to the previous way of doing things, I'm thinking, why would we ever go back to doing it the old way? Like this is a case where businesses, and the legal profession is one that tends to drag their heels when it comes to technology too, but a type of business has been forced into a new way of doing things. And all of a sudden the consumers are looking at this and saying, well, yeah, don't go back to the old way of doing it. We like this new way. So there's a big incentive for them to keep doing things the way that they've been forced to do in the last year and a half. So I think there's some good, as you mentioned, there's some good that's come out of that, because in being forced to try things in a different way, companies are seeing, oh, there is a piece of the market that wants to do it that way. And so maybe we can have a whole new piece of the market of people who like to do things online, as opposed to ones who want to go into the lawyer's office to sign papers. Yes.
Now, how do organizations foster that innovation when they're not forced to change, when their industry isn't being disrupted, or when there isn't a global pandemic? There are probably a lot of organizations in various pockets of the world that are for more or less tracking along at very much a similar pace, or doing similar things that they were doing, 2-3 years ago. But as organizations figure out this sort of, okay, this is the way we've got to track forward, but how do you keep fostering that innovation so that it's you don't have to wait for change to be thrust upon you or forced upon you?
Well, I think that change for many companies does have to be forced upon them, and maybe it doesn't have to be forced upon them by a global pandemic, but it might be forced upon them by their competition doing something that they haven't done before. So it's still kind of being forced upon them. You will have the ones who are out in front, who are the innovators, who are the leaders, but that's a small portion of the market. And I don't think we need to worry about how to keep innovation going within the leaders. It's really, it's the rest of the ones where we have to worry about that. So in a lot of cases, they're going to be, chasing the leaders. And that's the thing that's going to be forcing them to think about this. Now, you really have to have, with any kind of innovation, this has to come from the top down. And I know that's a little bit of a shop-worn phrase, but it's not about just somebody up at the top, the CEO saying like, oh, we will be innovative. Okay, I'm going back to my golf game now. It's not like that. You have to have goals set at a corporate level that are about achieving certain things. So maybe it's about, whether they're sort of hard numbers like revenue goals or whatever, maybe it's innovation, maybe it's about market share, whatever it is. And then there has to be a way to trace those goals right from there down into the operational processes and then into the individual activities that are being done. And so that if you have a goal at the top level, you know that there's business processes at the operational levels that are helping to fulfill that goal, and that there's people doing the jobs, doing the tasks in those processes that are helping those processes. So you have to kind of look at that business architecture all the way down. Because if you don't have that sense of traceability from the top level goals down to what people are doing at their day-to-day, the individual contributor level, then you're not ever going to achieve those goals. And the same thing, if somebody down at that bottom level is working away at some activity and you can't trace that activity back up to a corporate goal somewhere, then you kind of wonder, why are they doing that? So that is a place where you start to look for things that you don't need to be doing. Now that's sort of a class, more of a classic lean, reducing waste sort of view of it, to look at that bottom up. But the top down, I think, is the important thing, because the executives of a company have to be able to provide some sort of guidance around, this is what we want to do as a company. We want to, move into these different markets, or we want to have these different kinds of products, or we need to have this amount of market share, or we need to generate these kinds of revenues. And then they need to rely on the people within their organization to figure out how to get that done. And that's where we get into things like the business automation, or reworking how the organization is laid out, or so on. But you can't really do that unless you're working towards some kind of goal.
Yes, yeah. And then, as you were saying before, having a strong link between what the corporate objectives to, okay, well, what are the daily micro tasks that we need to do to make that happen?
Right. And that alignment comes through incentives at these different levels. And this is one of the things where things can go horribly wrong when you're doing different, and I see this a lot with different kinds of automation projects, and especially when you're not taking that end-to-end view. So for me, when you're really doing a BPM approach, it's about having that end-to-end view, including the whole customer journey. So it's like, what starts a process, and when do you consider a process to be complete? And looking at all the pieces that have to go through there. And that probably runs through several different departments. They each have their own processes within there, and then things get handed off from one to another. And if you have a departmental process, and the manager of that departmental process is only thinking about, oh, this is how to make my process more efficient. And if their incentives are based on how efficient their process is, they're not thinking about how it fits into the end-to-end process, and how that sort of leads up or rolls up to the corporate goals. So you have to make sure that, and it's not like you don't want to have incentives to make departmental processes more efficient and so on. Obviously, you want to look at that, but you need to have something in every departmental process. There has to be something that ties to those higher goals. And that is about how the managers are rewarded for what they're doing. So a part of their incentives as employees has to be based on not just their departmental performance, but how this feeds into the corporate goals. The same with people at the individual contributor level. So yeah, it's great if somebody is really good at what they do and they're doing one particular task, but maybe their skills could be used better if they're helping to train other people in the area. So, or collaborating with other people to make sure that work is done in a more consistent manner. So you have to make sure that the people have the correct incentives, that the employees have the correct incentives to make sure that they're doing the right thing, not just for this very local task that they're doing, but across their department, and then how that fits into the whole end-to-end process and how that serves the corporate goals. So if you don't have that view of the whole business architecture and the traceability from top to bottom and from bottom back up to top, then you're going to have a hard time achieving that. Yes.
And I guess that with making sure that people are aware of, I guess, upstream and downstream impact, what is actually happening in other areas of the business. I guess you're trying to avoid any competition or internal competitiveness, that's going to mean that, you know, different areas or teams or departments are fighting for budget and resources, without seeing that actually we're all in this together. We're all part of the same team. We're all working towards the same corporate objectives. You know,
Right.
if I get all the budget and all the resources, we actually aren't going to achieve what ultimately, as a team, as an overall team, we're setting out to, what we're trying to achieve. There needs to be that understanding of like every area of the business is valuable, is important, and we need to understand that and work together. So I think that's good.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I've seen places where it's not just a matter of one doesn't sort of think about what the other is doing, but they're actively doing things that are worse for other departments further downstream in the process. So there was one example I saw of a company, and they hired service workers of a type that went out and then did work for clients. So kind of an agency model of people that went out and did work for clients. And the group that was doing the hiring, is their incentives were based purely on how many people they hired, how many people got onboarded, not on the quality of those, not on how long they lasted or anything. So then downstream, you have this huge turnover rate because they were just taking like anybody with a pulse and bringing them in and hiring them and onboarding them. And then further down, like they just washed out because they weren't good at the job. They weren't suited to the job, or they weren't really dedicated to it or whatever. So if you have these vastly different incentives in certain areas that aren't tied to the corporate goals, and when I point out things like that, and that's why I like to do sort of walkthrough of operations as well. And when I point out things like that, the higher level executives are like, oh yeah, I never thought about that. And it's like, well, you have to have that traceability. If you're giving somebody an incentive in a certain area, you have to make sure that that's really tied in with corporate goals. And in this case, it was actually decreasing the benefits that they wanted to get at their corporate goals without anybody really realizing it. And it just been sort of running amok like that for a number of months.
Right. And now when we're talking about the future and what the future looks like, obviously, I mean, you would have seen many different improvements to the BPM space and the way that organizations manage their business processes over the last number of years. And when you look forward the next 2, 3, 5 years, I mean, you've already touched on various topics like automation, which for some organization they've been doing for a long time. For others, they haven't even dipped their toes into the world of automation yet. But what do you say the next 2, 3, 5 years look like when it comes to how organizations manage their processes, and where do you feel like organizations should be investing their time, effort, and energy?
Well, for me as a technologist, I always think about the technology. So although just having a business process practice where you understand and document your processes, but still work with them in a manual way, a lot of value to that. But I really see the value is coming with the more amount of automation. And in fact, the future of BPM and even the current state of BPM is that in many cases, it doesn't even use the term BPM anymore when you start to get into the technology side of things. And it's because what started out as BPM systems have now been expanded into these much more comprehensive application environments. So now you've got things like automated decisioning and rules, and you've got robotic task automation, you've got microservices, you've got data science and analytics in there, you've got artificial intelligence and machine learning. And all of these things are coming together. That's kind of a big laundry list of technology components. But the business implication is that business automation is not just about process. It's about making better decisions. It's about understand what's happening or what has happened. And then it's about understanding and trying to predict outcomes, and then automating some of the human tasks along the way. So I think that the future of BPM needs to consider the technology and the automation part of things. If you're not doing automation, if all you're doing is documenting your processes, that's not enough anymore, because your competitors are certainly doing some level of automation. And that's what allows them to do things like customer self-service. You can't have an online store and customer self-service if you don't have some degree of automation in there. So you have to be looking at how to automate some of the processes. It doesn't mean that everybody's job is going away. It doesn't mean that there will be, nothing for people to do. What it means is that people will be able to use their, kind of intelligence to think about knowledge work, to be able to solve problems, things that are harder to solve through automation. And if you have people focused on solving problems and dealing with customers, and you let the automation look after all of the routine tasks that are just done the same way every time, then you end up with much more efficient and cost-effective operations, which is good, but ones where a customer can still get help with solving a problem if there's a problem. So you have to have that balance between the people side, the knowledge workers, and the automation to do the things that don't require a person's opinion to decide on what happens.
Right. And for someone listening right now to our conversation that they're learning a lot about, obviously, the topic of BPM, well, I certainly am. And so I'm sure that our audience is learning a lot as well. Where would you encourage them to go to learn more about this topic? Because, we've got a large audience that, and as I mentioned at the start, they're from a range of different organizations. Some of them are at a very early stage in terms of their BPM journey. And so I guess there is this interest to learn more. What should I be doing in my organization? What will work for our organization when it comes to improving our business processes? Where would you encourage them to go, I guess, to continue this learning?
Well, you can certainly start on my blog, column2.com. I've written over a million words over the years. So there's a lot where I've attended BPM conferences and I've written about what the speakers have been and my opinions on it, because this is it's unsponsored, just my own opinions on there. So I will talk about products that I see that I like or don't like. I will go to conference sessions, and then we'll talk about what the speaker was saying and what my interpretation of that and why this was important or not important, and also talk about other things that are happening in our space. So, and not just my blog, but you'll see me link to other ones as well. There's a lot of great people who are writing things on a daily basis or maybe a weekly basis out there. There's so many resources out there, though. Like universities are now offering online courses in BPM topics. QUT was doing, Queensland University was doing some a few years ago. It's the Eindhoven University does a great process mining course online. So you can find courses on a particular topic, not about a specific vendor's technology, but more about the technology in general, if you're interested in learning a bit about automation in a space, or if you want to learn about principles of business process management that don't have anything to do with automation, just why you would want to get more control of your processes, just what the what the different tools are, modeling, how would you collect information and model your processes, and so on. So there's so many, as I say, a lot of online courses there. Definitely some very good books. I list on my blog of some different books that are very useful as well in this area. I will tend to look at more current information, although the books are valuable, and I've contributed to a few of the books, so I don't want to say that the books aren't good, but it's just that I find that the more current information, because the market changes so quickly, if you're starting to look at automation products, so you have to start to follow blogs from different people, sort of some information that comes from vendors, although you do want to take that with a grain of salt, but it's just being able to just see what's happening in the marketplace. I find that different conferences and now that we can attend conferences virtually, this is a big help as well. There's a whole range of conferences that you can attend that are not specific to any vendor's products, but can provide you with a lot of information about how you might use certain types of technology or how different modeling techniques work and so on. There's an academic conference on BPM that happens every year in September. Last year, it started in Europe and has normally been in Europe, although it's been in actually QUT hosted it one year, and it's been a couple of other places. This year, they have announced that it's going to be a combination of in-person and hybrid. It'll be in Rome in September. And I find the academic conferences are good because they show you some of the research that's coming out. And this is not just technology research. There's research in psychology, for example, about how people adapt to change or how process models can be used as a communication technique. So a lot of things that are really around the non-automation parts of it, and then things around the automation side as well. So a lot of good stuff at academic conferences. And many of the vendor conferences, if you look at the vendor conferences, which they're now doing a lot of these online as well, they'll provide you with definitely some things about their product, but there will be other speakers there who are talking about more general topics. Right. And this is sometimes I get invited to speak at vendor conferences and I don't talk about their products. I talk about more general topics. So there will be speakers like me who are guest speakers at these conferences who can provide some value too, even if you're not interested in the products that vendor has to offer. So lots of reading out there, lots of things to watch. It's you go out there, you start looking at you open it up and start looking, and you probably find so much content you won't have time to look at it all.
That's right. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that with us, Sandy. But I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today and having this conversation. As I mentioned, I've been gleaning a lot and taking a lot of notes, and I'm sure that our audience will be as well. So on behalf of the Process Pioneers community, thanks for sitting down and having this chat with me.
Well, thanks for having me here today, Dan.